I never thought I would ever have to recount these events. To be perfectly honest, I have spent the last 8 months of my life trying to claw back some semblance of sanity by burying every memory of what happened at Versa Zoo. I wanted to forget the sounds, the smells, and the cold, suffocating dread that settled in my bones during those long nights. But this morning, everything changed. I saw the front page headline of the Times, a massive, unexplained explosion at the zoo, followed by the mysterious disappearance of nearly the entire night shift staff. I realized then that I couldn't keep my mouth shut any longer. Silence isn't just cowardice anymore, it's a death sentence for whoever might be next. My name is Marcus Chen, and this is what really happened. I was 28 years old, a psychology graduate from St. University. On paper, I was an educated man, but in reality, I was a failure. I had been unemployed for 7 months, my resume gathering dust while my student loans ballooned to a staggering $45,000. To make matters worse, my mother's heart condition was worsening, and the medical bills were piling up faster than I could count. I was drowning. I was the kind of desperate man who would have walked into a burning building for a handful of cash. That desperation led me to a listing on Craigslist. It was simple, almost too good to be true. Night security guard needed for Versa Zoo. $4, $200 per month. Immediate start. In this city, a standard security gig might pay $1,500, maybe $2,000 if you're lucky. $4,200 was a fortune. Any rational person would have paused. They would have asked why a zoo was paying executive-level wages to a man with a flashlight. But I didn't have the luxury of rationality. I called the number immediately. The interview was scheduled for that Friday afternoon at the zoo's administrative wing. The office was clinical, cold, gray, and smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. Mr. Devkovsky, the operations director, sat behind a heavy oak desk. He was a man in his late 60s, with hair as white as bone and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. He didn't look like a man who ran a zoo. He looked like a man who managed a prison. "Mr. Chen," he began, his voice dry and raspy, like sandpaper on wood. "I'll be straight with you. This isn't a job for the faint of heart. In the last 6 months alone, we've seen 15 guards walk out that gate. Some didn't even wait for their first paycheck." I swallowed hard, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down my neck. "Why, sir? Is the work that dangerous?" "The reasons vary," Devkovsky replied, his gaze never wavering. "Some say the stress is too much. Some say the isolation gets to them. But mostly," he paused, leaning forward until the fluorescent light glinted off his glasses. "Mostly, they find they cannot follow the rules." "The rules?" I echoed. Devkovsky reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, black-bound notebook. It was heavy, maybe 50 pages long, with gold leaf lettering embossed on the cover. Standard operating procedures for night security. Versa Zoo, version 3.7. 47 pages of absolute directives, Devkovsky said, sliding the book across the desk toward me. "You are to read every word. You are to commit them to memory. You will follow them without exception, without deviation, and most importantly, without question. Do you understand?" I opened the first page. The text was typed in a rigid, formal font. Rule number 1. Never, under any circumstances, look an animal directly in the eye after 11 p.m. Rule number 2. If you hear the sound of human laughter coming from the elephant enclosure, vacate the area immediately. Do not return for at least 2 hours. Rule number 3. Always carry a secondary, high-lumen flashlight. Should your primary light source fail while you are within the gorilla exhibit, do not move. Close your eyes and count to exactly 100 before attempting to turn on your backup. I looked up, a confused smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. This feels a bit like a prank, sir. Is this some kind of psychological test?" Devkovsky's expression didn't change. Not a muscle moved in his face. "Do you want the job, Mr. Chen? Your mother's bills won't pay themselves, will they?" The air in the room felt suddenly very thin. He knew about my mother. He knew exactly how much power he held over me. I looked down at the black book, then at the contract beside it. "Yes," I whispered. "I want the job." "Good. You start Monday. Your shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 6 nights a week. You will be trained for 3 nights by our senior guard, Mike Harrison. After that, you are on your own." He pushed another document toward me. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. $500,000 in liquidated damages if you speak a word of what happens inside these gates. Sign it." I signed. I didn't care about the fine print. I just saw the dollar signs that would save my family. "One last thing, Mr. Chen," Devkovsky said as I stood to leave. "Read that book. Study it like your life depends on it. Because in this facility, it very well might." Monday night came all too quickly. At 9:45 p.m., I stood before the iron gates of Versa Zoo. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy against your eardrums. Mike Harrison met me at the gate. He was a gaunt man, appearing much older than his 40-odd years. His skin was the color of parchment, and the dark circles under his eyes looked like bruised hollows. He looked like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to sleep. "Marcus, right?" he grunted, opening the gate with a heavy clink of keys. "Welcome to the madhouse. Is it really that bad?" I tried to joke, but the humor died in my throat as we walked past the first set of cages. Under the sun, Versa Zoo was a place of families and popcorn. Under the moon, it was a sprawling labyrinth of shadows. The security lights were dim, flickering with a low, rhythmic hum that set my teeth on edge. I could hear things, heavy bodies shifting in the darkness, the scrape of claws against concrete, and low, guttural sounds that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard on a nature documentary. "First rule of the job," Mike said as we reached the security hub, a cramped room filled with flickering monitors and the smell of stale coffee. "Everything in that book has a reason. Don't go trying to be a scientist. Don't go trying to be a hero. You see something weird, you follow the rule, and you keep your head down." He pointed to the screens. Most of the cameras were infrared, showing grainy, ghostly shapes moving in the enclosures. We use minimal lighting after 11. Bright lights, they agitate them. "The animals?" I asked. Mike paused, his hand hovering over a switch. He looked at me with an expression that was halfway between pity and fear. "Sure," he said quietly, "the animals." At exactly 10 p.m., Mike stood up and grabbed his heavy belt. "Time for the first patrol." We follow the sequence. Birds, then reptiles, then small mammals, then elephants, then gorillas, and we finish at the big cats. Always that order. Rule 15. If you get turned around, you don't. Find your way back. You return to the security hub and start the sequence over from the beginning. You got that? "Why the order?" "Because the things in this zoo like routines," Mike replied, his voice barely a whisper. "And you don't want to surprise them." As we entered the bird exhibit, the air became thick with the smell of wet feathers and something metallic. As we passed the eagle's cage, a sound erupted from the shadows. It wasn't a screech. It was a giggle, a high-pitched, mocking human giggle. I turned my head instinctively, my flashlight swinging toward the cage. Mike's hand clamped onto my shoulder like a vice, his fingers digging into my muscle. "Rule number 1, Marcus. Eyes front. Don't you dare look at it." I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The giggling continued, growing louder, more frantic, sounding like a dozen people laughing at a joke I didn't want to hear. I kept my eyes locked on the back of Mike's head until we cleared the building. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my light. "What? What was that?" I gasped once we were outside. Mike didn't answer. He just kept walking, his boots rhythmic against the gravel. We moved through the reptile house, where the snakes didn't slither. They stood coiled, their eyes reflecting our lights with an intelligence that felt malicious. But it was the elephant enclosure that broke me. As we approached the massive stone walls, the joyful, clear laughter of a child rang out through the night air. It was beautiful and innocent, yet in the context of a darkened zoo at 1 a.m., it was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. Mike stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't even look at the enclosure. He checked his watch, his face turning a shade of gray that matched the stone walls. 2 hours, he breathed. Rule number 2, we leave. Now. But Mike, there's a kid in there. We have to. There is no kid, Marcus. Mike hissed, grabbing me by the collar and shoving me back toward the path. "There is nothing in there but death. Now run!" We ran. We didn't stop until we were back in the security hub with the door bolted shut. Mike slumped into his chair, his chest heaving. He didn't look at the monitors. He just stared at the floor, his lips moving in a silent prayer. I stood there, looking at the black rulebook on the desk. I realized then that the $4.200 wasn't a salary. It was a bribe to keep me from noticing that I wasn't guarding animals. I was guarding a nightmare. The next 2 nights of training were a blur of adrenaline and forced apathy. Mike taught me how to navigate the blind spots of the cameras, how to check the heavy electronic seals on the cages without making eye contact with whatever was pacing inside, and how to breathe through the overwhelming urge to scream. By Thursday morning, Mike looked like a man who had reached the end of his rope. "I'm done, Marcus," he said as the sun began to bleed over the horizon on Friday morning. He was packing a small canvas bag, his hands shaking so violently he could barely zip it shut. "The 2 years are up. I'm leaving the city. If you're smart, you'll take that first paycheck and do the same." "Where are you going?" I asked, looking at the hollow shell of a man I had spent 48 hours with. "Somewhere without cages," he whispered. "Somewhere where the only thing I hear at night is the wind." "Don't look for the truth, Marcus. The truth doesn't want to be found, and if it finds you, it won't let go." He left without looking back. That night, Friday, I was truly alone. The silence of Versa Zoo at night isn't a natural silence. It's a heavy, expectant pressure, like the air before a devastating storm. I sat in the security hub, the flickering light of 47 monitors casting a sickly blue glow over the room. I felt like a captain on a ghost ship, steering a vessel through a sea of shadows. Every creak of the building, every distant howl felt amplified, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I remembered the black rulebook. Rule number 47 was written in red ink. If you see your own reflection smiling in the security room mirror when you are not smiling, leave the zoo immediately. I spent the first 2 hours of my solo shift pointedly avoiding the small, cracked mirror hanging over the coffee station. I felt ridiculous, a grown man, a psychology graduate, terrified of his own reflection, but in this place, logic felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. Around 1 a.m., the restlessness became too much. I needed to know more. I turned my attention to the security computer. Mike had warned me to stick to the live feeds, but the curiosity that had driven me through 4 years of university began to itch. I began digging through the directories, bypassing the standard logs, until I found a folder buried deep within the system, encrypted but poorly hidden. It was titled, Personnel Files Former. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked it open. There were 15 files. 15 men and women who had sat in this very chair before me. The first was Robert Mitchell. He had lasted 2 months. The final entry in his log was dated October 15th. It was short, frantic. I can't ignore the voice in number 7 anymore. He sounds so much like my brother. I'm going to check. Just one look. There was no further entry. A sidebar note from the administration stated, "Subject violated rule number 34. Employment terminated. Missing person report filed with local authorities. Car abandoned in lot." I felt a cold chill wash over me. Terminated. The word felt final in a way that had nothing to do with being fired. I scrolled down to James Thompson. His cause of departure was listed as accidental death. The notes indicated he had developed an unhealthy fixation with rule number 1. He had spent his final night staring into the eyes of the predators through the infrared cams. He was found at the base of the security building with a snapped neck. No witnesses. No explanation for why he had climbed to the roof in the middle of a storm. But it was the last file that stopped my breath. Sarah Kim. Sarah had been a guard only a year ago. Unlike the others, her file was filled with detailed reports that read like the journal of a woman descending into madness, or a woman discovering a horrific reality. March 12th. The gorillas aren't gorillas. They move like people. When they think the cameras are off, they stand upright. I heard a girl crying in there tonight. Not an animal sound. A human child. I called the extension for code 7, but Devkovsky just told me to mind my business. April 5th. There are transport trucks arriving at 3 a.m. They don't carry animals. They carry crates marked Biological Material Genesis Corp. The smell, it's like a butcher shop that hasn't been cleaned in weeks. May 1st, I found it. Beneath enclosure number 7. There's a basement, a whole world under the concrete. I heard the screams. They aren't animals, Marcus. They're breeding something. Something that shouldn't exist. My name wasn't in the file, of course, but reading her words felt like she was speaking directly to me. At the very bottom of the document, in a scanned image of a handwritten note, she had scribbled, "I'm not crazy. They're taking me to Hillcrest Asylum because I saw too much. If anyone reads this, you have to help them." Behind the electrical panel in the Jaguar cage, there is a keypad. The password is Genesis. Save the children. I sat back, the air escaping my lungs in a long, shaky hiss. Genesis. I had seen that name before in medical journals, a massive biotech conglomerate known for pioneering genetic research. But what were they doing in a municipal zoo? Suddenly, the monitor for camera 23, the one pointed at the rear service entrance of enclosure number 7, flickered. The screen, which had been showing a static-filled view of a concrete wall, suddenly cleared. A woman was standing there. She was wearing the same gray security uniform I was wearing. Her hair was matted and her face was pale, but it was undoubtedly Sarah Kim. She was standing perfectly still, looking directly into the lens of the camera. She began to smile, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across her face. Then she leaned forward, her face filling the screen. Her eyes were not human. They were milky white, devoid of pupils or irises, like the eyes of a fish left too long on the dock. She didn't speak, but her lips moved. I didn't need a degree in psychology to read them. "Run," she mouthed, "or join us." The screen exploded into static. I jumped back, knocking my chair over, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I scrambled to the monitors, frantically switching between feeds, but camera 23 remained dead. I looked at the mirror over the coffee station. For a split second, I saw myself. My reflection was standing there, staring back at me, but as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, my reflection did something I didn't. It slowly raised a finger to its lips, as if telling me to be quiet. And then, it smiled. I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and my jacket and bolted for the door. I didn't care about the $4, $200, I didn't care about the student loans. I just needed to be away from the shifting shadows and the smiling reflections. But as I reached the main gate, I found it chained from the outside. A heavy, industrial padlocked chain that hadn't been there when I arrived. I was trapped. And from the darkness of the elephant enclosure, I heard it again. The joyful, clear laughter of a child. The rattling of the heavy iron chains against the gate was the only response to my frantic pulling. The cold metal bit into my palms, and the realization sank in like a lead weight in my stomach. I wasn't being kept out, I was being kept in. I turned around, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic, shaky path through the darkness. The zoo had transformed. The familiar paths now felt like the guts of a sprawling prehistoric beast, and I was the parasite it was preparing to digest. The laughter from the elephant enclosure grew louder, echoing off the stone walls until it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. I stumbled back toward the security hub, my only sanctuary, but as I reached the door, the landline phone inside began to ring. It was a sharp, piercing sound that sliced through the night. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Who would be calling a zoo security desk at 3:15 in the morning? I entered the room and picked up the receiver. "Marcus Chen," a voice said. It wasn't human. It was a synthesized, digital approximation of a voice, devoid of inflection or soul. "Your performance tonight has been disappointing. Rule 47 was quite clear. Who is this? Why is the gate locked?" I shouted into the phone, my voice cracking. "Check your personal email, Marcus. We find that visual aids are often more persuasive than words." With shaking fingers, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and refreshed my inbox. There was a single message from an encrypted address. I opened it, and the breath left my body. There were 3 photographs. The first was of my mother. She was asleep in her hospital bed at Mercy General, her face pale against the white linens. The angle was close, dangerously close. Someone had been standing right over her while she slept. The second was of my brother David, sitting in his car at a red light on 5th Avenue, unaware of the camera positioned inches from his window. The third was of our home. It was a shot of our living room, taken from the vantage point of someone standing just inside the front door. "What do you want?" I whispered, tears of pure, unadulterated terror stinging my eyes. "The basement. Marcus." The robotic voice replied, "Enclosure number 7. You have exactly 10 minutes to reach the service entrance. If you are not inside by then, your mother's heart monitor will experience a fatal technical surge. Do not test us." The line went dead. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I ran. I sprinted past the bird exhibit, ignoring the mocking giggles that followed me. I tore past the gorilla exhibit, blocking out the sound of the little girl sobbing in the dark. I reached the big cat exhibit, my lungs burning, my heart thundering like a trapped bird against my ribs. Enclosure number 7. The jaguar cage. The heavy electronic lock hummed as I approached. I found the electrical panel Sarah Kim had described in her notes. Behind a loose metal flap was a glowing blue keypad. I punched in the letters GENESIS. There was a series of heavy mechanical thuds, like the deadbolts of a vault being retracted. The rear wall of the enclosure, a massive slab of reinforced concrete, slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. Beyond it lay a corridor of white tile and stainless steel, lit by harsh, flickering fluorescent tubes that made the world look like a bleached bone. I stepped inside, and the concrete slab slid shut behind me, sealing out the sounds of the zoo. Here, the air smelled different. It didn't smell like animals or nature. It smelled of bleach, formaldehyde, and the ozone of high-voltage machinery. The corridor sloped downward, deeper into the earth than I thought possible. As I descended, the silence was replaced by a low-frequency thrumming, the sound of a massive life support system. At the end of the hall, I pushed through a set of heavy double doors and stopped dead. I was standing in a high-tech nightmare. The room was vast, a subterranean laboratory filled with rows of towering glass cylinders. Each cylinder was filled with a bubbling, translucent green fluid. And inside the fluid, I approached the first tank, my stomach churning. Suspended in the liquid was a creature that defied every law of nature. It had the muscular torso of a man, but its head was that of a massive canine, its jaws frozen in a permanent, silent snarl. Its skin was a patchwork of fur and bruised human flesh, stitched together with surgical precision. I moved to the next tank. Inside was a child, a girl no older than 7 or 8. But from her shoulder blades, long, leathery bat wings had been grafted, pinned back against the glass. Her eyes were open, staring blankly into the green abyss. "She's still dreaming," a voice said from the shadows. I whirled around, my flashlight catching a woman in a white lab coat. She had sharp features, short blonde hair, and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world and kept on watching. She held a suppressed pistol leveled at my chest. "I am Dr. Elena Volkov," she said, her Russian accent thick but precise. "And you, Mr. Chen, are quite late for your shift." "What is this place?" I gasped, gesturing to the horrors in the tanks. "What have you done to them?" "We are perfecting the human form," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "Evolution is too slow, Marcus. Genesis Corporation believes in acceleration. We take the best of the animal kingdom, the senses, the strength, the instincts, and we marry them to the human intellect. We are building the soldiers of the next century." "They're children," I hissed, my horror turning into a cold, sharp rage. "You're mutilating children." "We are giving them a purpose," Volkov countered. "These are the forgotten ones, the orphans, the runaways. Black Serpent brings them to us, and we turn them into gods." She stepped closer, the light reflecting off her glasses. "But gods are difficult to control. They experience psychological instability. They remember things they shouldn't. That is why you are here, Marcus. You are a psychologist. You are going to help us break their spirits so we can rebuild their minds. I'll never help you, I spat. Oh, I think you will, Volkov said, stepping aside to reveal a large monitor on the wall. On the screen was a live feed of the boardroom upstairs. Sitting at a long mahogany table was a man I recognized instantly. The white hair, the cold gray eyes. Mr. Devkovsky. But beside him sat a man who made my blood run cold. He was tall, wearing a bespoke suit, with a face that had appeared on every news channel for the last decade. Is that Senator Hammerton? I whispered. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Volkov confirmed. Genesis has many fathers, Marcus, and many protectors. But look at the man on the end. The camera panned to a man sitting in the shadows at the far end of the table. He turned his head, and my heart stopped. He looked exactly like the man in the fading photograph my mother kept on her nightstand. The man who had supposedly died in a car accident 20 years ago. Dad? The word was a broken exhale. He didn't die, Marcus, Volkov said softly. He was recruited. He's been the lead architect of the Genesis project for 2 decades. And he's the one who suggested you for the role of behavioral specialist. The door behind me hissed open again, and 2 armed guards in black tactical gear stepped in. Come, Marcus, Volkov said, gesturing with the gun. Your father is waiting. It's time for a family reunion. The walk to the boardroom felt like a march to the gallows. The guards didn't speak. They were like statues of Kevlar and cold steel, their footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that made the tiled floor feel like it was vibrating. We passed through a final set of blast doors and into a room that looked like a temple dedicated to power. The air was chilled, and the scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch fought against the underlying hospital smell of the facility. My father, the man I knew as Devkovsky but who had once been David Chen, didn't stand up when I entered. He sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, looking at me with a mixture of clinical interest and a sorrow so deep it looked like it had been carved into his bones. Marcus, he said. His voice was no longer the dry rasp of the zoo director. It was the voice I remembered from my childhood, the one that used to read me stories before the world fell apart. I suppose there is no use in apologizing for the theater of the last few days. You're alive, I said, my voice barely a whisper. 20 years. We buried an empty casket. Mom spent a decade crying herself to sleep, and you were down here, building monsters? I was saving your life, he snapped, the sudden fire in his eyes startling me. He stood up, pacing the length of the room. Genesis didn't ask me to join, Marcus. They took me. They gave me a choice. I could watch my family be erased from existence, or I could become the brain that built their future. I chose to live. I chose for you to live. By kidnapping other people's children? I shouted, stepping toward him, until a guard's rifle butt slammed into my ribs, forcing me to my knees. Every great leap in human history is paved with the bones of the few. Senator Hammerton interjected, his voice smooth and practiced, the tone of a man who had sold his soul long ago and forgotten the price. The world is changing, Marcus. The next war won't be fought with tanks or drones. It will be fought with biological superiority. Genesis is ensuring that we are the ones holding the leash. He's right, Marcus, my father said, leaning over me. And now they want a return on their investment. They've watched you. They've seen your work in psychology. The hybrids. They are physically perfect, but their minds are fractured. They are too traumatized to be reliable. We need you to bridge that gap. We need you to turn them into soldiers. I looked up at him, the man I had mourned for 20 years, and realized he was far more terrifying than the creatures in the tanks. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had convinced himself that evil was a necessity. I have a counter-proposal, I said, my voice low and steady as I pushed myself off the floor. I looked at Dr. Volkov, who was standing near the door, her hand still tight on her pistol. I had seen the way she looked at the hybrids, not with pride, but with a flickering, buried guilt. Dr. Volkov and I were discussing the psychological instability of the subjects. I continued, turning to the board. The problem isn't their trauma. It's the lack of a primary anchor. They need a reason to follow. If you kill me or my mother, you lose the only mind capable of engineering that loyalty. But if you give me access to the training protocols, I can stabilize them. My father narrowed his eyes. You're stalling, Marcus. I'm surviving. I countered. Just like you did. Hammerton looked at my father and nodded. Give him 24 hours. Let him prove his worth. If he fails, we proceed with the disposal of his family and move to the next candidate. I was taken back to the lab, but this time the guards stayed outside. Volkov remained, her gun lowered. I looked at her, searching for the crack in her armor. They have your daughter, don't they? I whispered. She froze, her eyes darting to the security cameras. I don't know what you're talking about. Anya, Moscow facility. They showed me the feed, Alina. They're preparing her for the next phase. She's going to end up in a tank just like these children. Volkov's hand began to tremble. I can't stop them. They see everything. Not everything, I said, leaning in close. I saw the way the dogman looked at me. There is still a person in there. If we can trigger a system-wide breach, the hybrids will do the rest. They don't need behavioral conditioning. They need revenge. For a long moment, the only sound was the humming of the life support vats. Then, Volkov slowly reached into her lab coat and pulled out a small encrypted keycard. The self-destruct isn't a bomb, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's a chemical purge. If you trigger it, every door in the facility opens, and a concentrated neurotoxin is released into the vents. It's designed to sanitize the project, if it's ever compromised. I have the override codes, but it requires two-factor authentication. My DNA and your father's. I'll get his, I said. But we have to release the children first. We moved with the frantic energy of the condemned. Volkov worked the terminals, her fingers flying across the keys to bypass the internal sensors. I went to the tank of the girl with the bat wings. Cezra, I pressed my hand against the glass. I'm going to get you out, I mouthed. The girl's eyes flickered. She didn't look like a god or a soldier. She looked like a terrified child, trapped in a nightmare. Suddenly, the alarm klaxons erupted, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that turned the world red. Security breach. Level 4. Unauthorized access detected in Sector B. They know. Volkov screamed. The blast doors began to hiss shut. I grabbed a heavy oxygen canister from a nearby rack and swung it with every ounce of my strength against Cezra's tank. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. I swung again. And again. On the third strike, the reinforced pane shattered. A torrent of green fluid erupted, throwing me across the floor. Cezra spilled out, gasping, her leathery wings unfurling in a wet, heavy heap. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a primal, ancient fear. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand. The lab doors were forced open. My father stepped in, but he wasn't alone. He held a heavy shotgun, and his face was a mask of cold fury. Behind him, the hybrids that had already been conditioned, the human leopard and the massive ape-like creature stalked forward, their eyes glazed and vacant. "You've made a terrible mistake, Marcus," my father said, raising the weapon. "No, Dad," I said, standing in front of Cezra. "You made yours 20 years ago." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small hidden camera I had been carrying since my first night. I held it up. "I've been streaming this to a cloud server for the last 10 minutes. Every word Hammerton said. Every tank in this room. The world is watching, Dad. You can't kill the truth." It was a lie. The signal couldn't penetrate the concrete, but it was the only psychological play I had left. My father hesitated, the barrel of the shotgun dipping for a fraction of a second. That was all the released hybrids needed. The dogman erupted from his tank, his powerful limbs shattering the glass. He didn't go for me. He went for the guards. The lab became a symphony of screams, shattering glass, and the wet sound of tearing flesh. "Alina, the code!" I yelled. Volkov slammed the keycard into the terminal. "I've bypassed the first lock!" "Marcus, I need your father's hand on this scanner." I dived for my father as he tried to reload. We went down in a tangle of limbs and old resentments. He was stronger than he looked, fueled by a desperate, twisted sense of purpose. He pinned me to the floor. The cold steel of the shotgun pressed against my throat. "I did it for you," he roared, his eyes brimming with tears. "Everything! Every child that died. I saw your face. I did it so you wouldn't have to." "Then let me go," I choked out. "Let this end." A shadow fell over us. The ape hybrid, the one my father had spent years perfecting, towered over him. It didn't attack. It just looked at him with a deep, sorrowful recognition. It remembered who had performed the surgeries. It remembered who had held the scalpel. It let out a mournful, human-sounding cry and swiped its massive hand. My father was thrown across the room, slamming into the primary control console. His hand landed squarely on the biometric scanner. Secondary authentication confirmed. Self-destruct sequence initiated. T-minus 10 minutes to chemical purge. "We have to go." Volkov grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the service elevator. I grabbed Cesra, throwing her over my shoulder. "What about the others?" I asked, looking at the dozens of tanks still filled with sleeping children. "The doors are open!" Volkov shouted over the roar of the alarms. "They have to save themselves now! If we stay, we all die!" We sprinted through the facility as it began to tear itself apart. Guards were no longer trying to capture us, they were fleeing for their lives. We reached the surface just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the zoo in shades of orange and pink. But we weren't alone. Standing by my car was Margaret Steele, holding a detonator of her own. Beside her stood Senator Hammerton, his face pale but composed. "You think a few videos and some dead guards will stop us?" Steele sneered. "Genesis is a global entity, Marcus. We own the media. We own the courts. By noon, this will be reported as a tragic gas leak caused by a disgruntled employee." "You." I looked at the USB drive my father had shoved into my hand in the chaos, the one containing the global facility locations. I looked at the hidden camera in my other hand. "Maybe," I said, "but I'm a psychologist, Margaret, and I know that the one thing people fear more than a monster is the truth of what they've allowed to happen." I turned to Volkov. "Get Cesra out of here. Take the car and drive. Don't stop until you're across the border." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I'm going to make sure they can't bury this," I said. I walked back toward the security hub, the place where it all began. I locked myself inside. I sat in the chair. I turned on every monitor. I pulled up the global transmission override my father had mentioned months ago in his notes. A failsafe for emergency broadcasts. I saw Steele and Hammerton approaching the door, their faces twisted in rage. I saw the helicopters circling above. I looked into the camera one last time. "My name is Marcus Chen," I said to the glowing red light, "and I am the last guard of Versa Zoo. What you are about to see will change everything." I hit send. The room exploded in a flash of white light as the chemical purge hit the electrical mains, triggering a massive, final detonation. The zoo, the lab, and the secrets of Genesis were consumed by fire. The last thing I saw wasn't the fire or the monsters or the men in suits. It was my mother's face, smiling at me from a memory of a time before the rules, before the tanks, and before the silence. I wasn't afraid. For the first time in 20 years, the cages were empty.